Okay, well, welcome everyone to our first Pay It Forward webinar of 2026. This is through the Canada chapter. My name is Tammy. I am the Events and Education Chair for the Canada chapter. And tonight we're going to be talking about whiskey. And as I mentioned to these three before everyone else got on, I really don't know anything. So I will remove myself before they even start talking. But I'm hoping that we're going to learn a lot and get our questions answered. We'll learn about the whiskey industry right now in general and in Canada. So, we've heard that it's a very exciting time right now. I know at the Pink Boots conference last month, we had like quite a few whiskey webinar or seminars. So that was pretty cool. So I will introduce Mirella and then remove myself. So Mirella, who's on my top left screen, is one of our members. She's done pretty much anything you can think of, I think, related to beer. And I won't even try to go into all that. She can tell you what she's done and what she's still doing. She is in Toronto. And so I will let her just take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks, Tammy. Let me put up my slide so it's official. There we go. So hello, everyone. Welcome to Canadian Whiskey Then and Now, the evolution of Canadian whiskey. This is, as Tammy mentioned, a Pay It Forward talk as part of a Pink Boots Pay It Forward component. And I have to say, I am a lifetime Pink Boots member. I joined at the very first meeting in San Diego in 2008. And this is the first scholarship that I've applied for. And I really am kicking myself because it's so wonderful to have access to these scholarships and these courses. So for those of you on the call who have been a member and have sort of been on the fence about applying, do it. Do it. You might not get it, but you might get it. And you certainly will not receive a scholarship if you don't apply. And it's just so cool. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. So as Tammy mentioned, my name is Mirella. I work in the beer education and sensory space. I've been doing so for about 20 years now. I have an award-winning book on beer. I also created a course on beer and food pairing, Mastering Beer and Food Pairing, brought to you by Beerology, which is another scholarship you can get through Pink Boots. And yeah, right now I'm working as the Senior Business Development Manager for beer at WSET. I'm super excited to have two fantastic people joining me for this panel discussion, and I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Stephen, do you want to say hello?
Okay, I was going to say, do I go first?
I gotcha.
Because it's if you read left to right, it's me. Hi everybody. My name's Stephen Beaumont. A lot of you on the brewing side will know me from 35 years of writing about beer, 15 books, too many articles to count. But about 5 years into my writing career, so around the mid-90s, I started adding spirits to my resume. And most recently, I co-authored the Canadian Spirits book, which was a guide to all of Canada's distilleries at the time. I wrote that with Christine Sismondo. And basically, I've gone from in about a decade and a half to being a non-believer in Canadian whiskey to feeling that Canadian whiskey is the most exciting whiskey market in the world today. And I truly believe that. And I'm excited about talking about that with you this evening. Caitlin.
Perfect, over to me. So I've got a bit of a weird background, as you can tell by the accent. I grew up in Scotland, but I was actually born in Winnipeg, so dual nationality. Decided at a young age that I was going to do my chemistry degree. Initially, I wanted to be a CSI tech. Realized very quickly into my chemistry degree I didn't want to spend my entire life in a lab setting. So switched, ended up doing a master's in brewing and distilling at Heriot-Watt University. So kind of like sister to the IBD program that you can take online. You can do like a full 4-year undergrad or 1-year master's program to get that. So I have my master's in brewing and distilling. Decided to go the distilling route and came straight back to Canada right after school. So have been now in the Canadian whiskey industry for approaching 11 years. Started kind of as a shift distiller at a craft distillery, working my way up to director of innovation and master distiller. And then most recently made the switch from craft to big producer. So I'm now just recently promoted from senior distillery supervisor. I'm now the distillery manager at Alberta Distillers, and that is like recent.
Amazing. Well, thank you both. This talk is a panel discussion, and I'm sure, as you can tell from these introductions, we're gonna learn from the best today. But before we dive in, I thought I would just provide some Canadian whiskey basics, so that we're all on the same page. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of history. The very first commercial distillery in Canada was in 1821. It was the Molson Distillery, started by a Molson, who we are familiar with in the beer. That's a name we're familiar with in beer. Thomas Molson was his name. And he started distilling primarily wheat, as was the style in England, where he was from. Another interesting date to note is 1846. And that's when a fine gentleman at one of our distilleries, Gooderham and Wirtz, developed something called the Riley still. And what this is essentially was a very rudimentary double distillation still. And when I say rudimentary, my understanding is it was a pile of rocks in a wooden structure. But the point is that it allowed for a lot more reflux and therefore a lot more rectification. And it allowed producers to make a whiskey that was much lighter in flavor. And that's something certainly that became associated with Canadian whiskey over time. 1886, Canada mandates a 1-year maturation period for the whiskey. And, for those who are familiar with whiskey, 1 year might not seem like a lot, but what is notable about this date is that Canada was the first country to mandate a minimum maturation period for the whiskey. The Scotch regulations didn't come in until 30 years later. So 1886, we mandate a 1-year minimum maturation period. 1890, it moves up to 2-year, and you can see much later on in 87, we moved it to 3 years, which is what it is now. And in that in-between time, from the 1920s to the 1970s, there was, Prohibition had just happened, or if you're in the US, it was in the midst of happening. And so the industry was struggling. And so in the wake of Prohibition, it was a really challenging time, and the breweries, the distilleries, I'm so used to talking about beer, here we are. The breweries consolidated through a series of acquisitions. And by the time we got to the early 70s, there were 8 dominant players in the whiskey industry. So it's good to know that this was a point in time on the continuum. So as I mentioned earlier, 87, we moved to a 3-year minimum. And then we fast forwarding to 2010, that's when we get our first craft distilleries in Canada. So that's just a really quick snapshot of some key dates and the way the industry evolved over that time. Also thought it would be fun to share a little comparison diagram comparing whiskey in Scotland, Ireland, the US, and Canada. And so you'll see here that there are many similarities and there are some differences. All 4 do have to, on some level, be produced in the country that they represent, which is great. The ingredients vary widely. So when we're talking about Scotch whiskey, if you have a single malt or a blended malt, it has to be 100% malted barley. And whether you have a single grain or a blended grain, it's malted barley and other grains. An interesting thing to note with Scotch whiskey is no exogenous enzymes are permitted. So what does that mean? That means the barley is providing the enzymes, and that's why you need that malted barley even in the grain whiskey. Otherwise, you will not be able to turn that starch into sugar and ferment it. With Irish whiskey, you can see there's various regulations of interest with pot still Irish whiskey. It has to be 30% or more malted barley and 30% or more unmalted barley. So that unmalted barley really gives quite a distinct flavor to that whiskey. If we're talking about malt whiskey from Ireland, as with Scotland, is 100% malted barley, and grain is 30% or more, 30% or less malted barley, as well as unmalted cereal. Did I do that backwards? I don't think so. It must be 30 or less. Okay, so with American whiskey, whether it be bourbon, which is corn-based, rye whiskey, wheat whiskey, malted rye whiskey, or malted wheat whiskey, you need at least 51% of that base grain. Corn whiskey is a little bit different. It needs to be at least 80% corn. So that's a huge jump. If you scan over to the right, though, the first thing you'll notice about Canadian whiskey is that any grain in any combination can be included in Canadian whiskey. So that is a point of difference in terms of the legislation. When we're looking at distillation strength as well, you'll notice that the right column is empty with Canadian whiskey. So what does that mean? It means that it can be distilled to any strength. So it can be extremely characterful or it can be extremely light. There's a wide berth there, a lot of room to play with between those grains and the distillation strength. So let's move forward to maturation. As I mentioned, we were the first. But as of now, across the board, pretty much everyone is looking for 3 years minimum maturation, with the exception of the US that doesn't really have regulations unless it's labeled as straight, in which case 2 years. And if it's labeled as bottled in bond, it has to be at least 4 years old. In terms of the wood, both Canadian and Scotch mandate a maximum size for the barrel. With the American whiskey, what they specify is that it has to be at it has to go in the barrel at 62.5% ABV or less, and it has to be aged in new charred oak. The only exception to that is corn whiskey, which does not have to be matured. It does not have to touch oak at all. If it does, though, it does have to be in a charred oak or new oak. All right, so here the cell that is blank is in Irish whiskey. So that's where people who are producing Irish whiskey really have room to play, is with the maturation and the type of wood. As long as it's 3 years, there's a lot of room to play within that. Finally, wanted to look at additions, permitted additions. So water and caramel color can be added to Scotch or Irish whiskey. American whiskey is pretty loosey-goosey. There's a range of permitted colorings, flavorings, and blending additions that are permitted, unless you're making bourbon, in which case you can only add water. You can't even add that caramel color, so very restrictive. And here is another peculiarity of Canadian whiskey in the additions, is that a maximum of 9.09% of that whiskey can be an addition of any combination of wines or spirits, but the spirits that are added have to be at least 2 years old. So it's a little bit more flexible, but at the same time, it's quite restrictive. We are able to make additions, but we're very limited in what we can add. So here's a question you might have. Why 9.09? That seems like a pretty arbitrary number. My understanding is that originally because blending has been part of making Canadian whiskey for a very long time, and eventually they started figuring out regulations. And I think it was around the 1930s that this particular amount was regulated. And my understanding is that at the beginning, the way they figured it out was you can have a batch, and then you can add up to 10% of the volume of that batch in additives. So you had like 100 and then plus 10%. And that was just, I think, caused a little bit of confusion. And eventually they just decided, let's keep the proportions, but bring it down to just what is that? Let's just call that whole thing a batch. And what portion does that represent? And it turned out to be 9.09. So that's how we came up with that number. And originally there was certainly a lot more. There were a lot more additions that were permissible, but slowly but surely the regulations became stricter and stricter until it was what it is now, which is just wines or spirits that are at least 2 years old. I had the darndest time researching this 9.09 rule, and I will continue to do so. I want to keep digging because I'm very interested in this progression. But suffice it to say that this has been this permission to make these additions has been a part of Canadian whiskey from the beginning. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now on the topic of the 9.09 rule and ask our fine panelists, how does that 9.09 rule manifest in Canadian whiskey today?
You go first, Caitlin.
Okay, perfect. I think from a production standpoint, which is what you'll hear me say many times throughout this, it's used as a blending ingredient, so we can alter the flavor with different flavoring agents, whether it be, you see a lot of people doing rum, tequila, sherry is a very common one. So instead of using the barrel influence like a lot of Scottish whiskey will do, either finishing or partial aging in these types of casks, we can actually take that spirit itself and add it in and add that flavouring aspect with it. It gives a lot of flexibility in production, and you can kind of target a flavour profile and work your way back to it with this kind of leeway in the 9.09 or 1/11th rule, as some people call it.
I'll throw in that the reason that this 1/11th rule came out is because of the United States. So post-prohibition, obviously it took time for American distilleries to get going again, and there was an opportunity there for Canadians. But the Americans also wanted to use up a lot of the excess alcohol they had. I've heard one explanation that talked about an overabundance of Florida oranges, and these oranges were basically going to rot if they didn't do something with them. So they made it into an orange wine. And the Americans decided to give Canadian whiskey, because we were already producing whiskey, they gave us a tax break if we incorporated some American wines or spirits into Canadian beverages. So the government passed this legislation allowing 1/11th of American or superfluous spirits or wines to be blended into Canadian whiskey. And that gave us a good price point going down into the United States. Now, this was really important because American blended whiskey, which we haven't spoken about yet, is allowed to be up to 80% grain neutral spirit. Now, grain neutral spirit, you're talking, this is basically vodka. And the rap against Canadian whiskey among whiskey geeks, especially during the 80s and 90s, because I heard a lot of this, was, oh, Canadian whiskey is just flavored vodka, because it was really light-bodied whiskey, and we had that 9.09 rule that allowed flavorings to be put into it. But it's very important to note, there is never any GNS in Canadian whiskey. Throughout the history of Canadian whiskey, there has never been allowed the use of GNS. So when Americans could make whiskey by using 20% 2-year-old whiskey and 80% GNS, this 9.09 rule allowed us to export down into the US and come in at a more competitive footing because we had that tax break. So it was a point of origin that was very important in terms of the history of Canadian whiskey. But the other thing, which is emphasized to me by Dr. Don Livermore of Hiram Walker, is Dr. Don is emphatic about the fact that there's always been blending in Canadian whiskey. It's what we're known for. So he's shown me recipes dating back into the 1800s that have used additions of things like prune wine, and really, like, at one point, tea. Back in the 1800s, tea was added. All sorts of different things would be added into the spirits in order to make them more approachable for consumers. And of course, a lot of this predated the aging requirement. So you had basically rot gut, and it's like, oh, let's throw some Earl Grey tea in there and make it more palatable. But out of these ignoble beginnings, this is how the blending tradition in Canada evolved.
It's interesting that you talk about the aging, because my understanding is that this addition is also a way to give a bit more of an aged flavor to a spirit by making
Well,
an
nowadays, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Back then, no, that wasn't a concern. But now you could take a 4-year-old whiskey and add a 16-year-old whiskey to give it a little more gravitas.
That's cool. And does that translate in a similar way on the palate, in your opinion?
What do you think, Caitlin?
I think like you can definitely tell the difference between a 16-year-old whiskey and a 1/11th 16-year-old whiskey. What it does is gives you the opportunity to kind of take a base spirit. So say you're making like a base 5-year-old whiskey, you can then add different types of whiskey, different types of flavoring agents, and make limitless numbers of different releases, different flavor profiles. So you don't need to be making as many different SKUs at your one particular distillery, and you can kind of flavor it in different ways. But I would say definitely like it does not taste the same as like a pure 16-year-old whiskey, but you get like the elements of it because typically Canadian whiskey is not neutral like GNS, but it is like more cleaner than a lot of kind of other like pot still whiskies that you get from Scotland. It takes on the flavouring agent quite well as well, so you kind of let that shine through with like a underlying kind of sweetness to the whiskey as well.
Nice.
As a professional taster, I would just add that there is no substitute for age. I
No.
mean, in the 35 years I've been doing this, I've actually had in my office trying these things out, these little magnetic resonance things that were supposed to age whiskey,
Mm-hmm.
vibrational things that were supposed to age whiskey, little casks that you could put your whiskey into and it would magically age in rapid succession. There's no substitute for proper warehousing and aging of a whiskey. That's just the way whiskey works.
Yeah, there's a patience that you need when you're making whiskey. Like you can flash age things with oak chips or, as Stephen said, the smaller barrels. It'll give you a rough idea what your spirit's going to taste like when it's aged, what the oak influence will be on it. But there's nothing that you can replicate that replicates that kind of resting in the maturation process and the angel share of the evaporation you get year over year and how that influences especially in Canada, the temperature swings as well. You can't replicate that in a small space of time.
I'm just having a moment because I'm noticing that Stephen and I both have books behind us, and Caitlin just
I
has
have,
bottles.
Bottles.
Amazing.
I had to move all my bottles away, actually.
You didn't have to. All right. So we're talking about the 9.09 rule, but that's not the only thing that makes Canadian whiskey unique as a category. I know, Stephen, you have strong feelings about that.
Well, so here's where I go back to what I said in my personal intro, is that Canadian whiskey is the most exciting whiskey market in the world today. And a lot of that relates to the excitement that's being generated by craft distillers. I have to make one note on what you say, your timeline, which was 2010 when craft distilling started. The first craft distillery in Canada got started in 1990. It was the first modern single malt distillery to start on this continent ever, like the first modern one, period. They didn't produce a whiskey until 2000. This is the Glen Breton distillery out in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. The distillery actually went bankrupt twice, and their founder actually died before they produced an actual whiskey. And I remember those whiskeys from 2000. They weren't very good. They were very expensive. But now that distillery is honestly one of Canada's finest. It is making absolutely stunning single malt whiskeys. So this is one of the elements that's happening in Canada right now. I know for the Americans who are watching, you have several single malt distilleries doing some very good stuff. Big fan of several of them. And you have they wrote legislation to govern American single malt whiskey production. I think Canada, like British Columbia alone, has so much outstanding single malt whiskey being produced right now. I just wrote a story for Whiskey Advocate where I did a whiskey trail on Vancouver Island. And I ran out of space to mention all the distilleries I wanted to talk about. And I had 1,500 words. This was a major feature. There's so much going on right now from these, and I'm learning about new places all the time. I just found out about this new distillery that started outside of Edmonton. I just found out about this small distillery working in Winnipeg, which I'm going to visit in a week and a half. There's so much excitement in the marketplace right now, and it's not just single malt. We have McAloney's out in Vancouver Island 2 years ago, won world's best single pot still whiskey and beat out all the Irish, beat out Redbreast, beat out all the Irish pot stills. We have weird grains being used, triticale being used, heritage grains like spelt being used. Just some phenomenal stuff. And Caitlin can speak more to this. Canadians do rye extraordinarily well. And there's a rye revolution going on in this country. So there's so much happening right now. It is truly, truly exciting.
I think honestly, from my perspective, Canadian whiskey as a category has had the biggest period of growth of any whiskey category that I've seen in a long time. Like I've been here for 10 years now, and thinking of even just in Alberta, like we were like there was one craft distillery when I got here. And we're now up to probably, I don't know, in excess of like 60, 70. There's a new one every other week. It's a tight-knit community and people were all talking and taking ideas from each other, and you see everyone trying out weird grains, weird still types. Like there isn't strict rules here and guidelines of type of still you need to use, type of grain you need to use, whether you can use enzymes or not. So everyone is doing something slightly different, which gives everyone, each distillery, their kind of own signature flavor, signature profile, which is unique because you typically get regions that will have signature profiles, but not so specific that each distillery has their own kind of flavor notes. And that's kind of where we're landing in Canada right now, is because there's so many variables you can change. You can pick and choose so many different things in the process that each individual distillery has almost like a fingerprint where you can taste something and you know it's from that distillery. And then obviously historically, rye has always been Canadian whiskey. As someone who grew up outside of Canada, like obviously I was aware of rye whiskey, but that's what everyone globally thought, and still to some extent in some countries think that Canadian whiskey is. They think all Canadian whiskey is rye whiskey, all rye whiskey is Canadian whiskey. It's getting better, especially with this continent. There's still a lot of Europeans that think the only Canadian whiskey they can get is Canadian Club or Crown Royal. It's slowly changing, but I think the use of the weird and wonderful grains and the grain mixtures and different types is kind of pulling us away from rye. But there is that research of everyone kind of trying to go back to it. Speaking as someone who now commercially makes rye, it's a very easy process. We've got our process down. But speaking as someone who also made it at craft level, it was an absolute nightmare to work with. Like when you've not got the equipment, when you've not got the process down, it is not an easy thing to make. So anyone that is managing it at craft level, I take my hat off. I tried it. I cried every day. It was not fun. But there's definitely a research in it, and it's that flavor profile that is so unique to Canada that a lot of people globally associate with Canadian whiskey as well.
For those who are unfamiliar with Alberta Distillers, where Caitlin works, I should mention that Alberta Distillers is the largest rye whiskey producer in the world by a considerable margin.
Yeah, yeah.
Nice. Well, we're talking about all this dynamism and all these different things going on, and I'm sure a lot of that came about with the craft distillers and the craft distilling movement. And Stephen, you told us a little bit about Glen Breton, but do you want to just walk us through that transition and what the distillers, how they set themselves apart in a market that already had some dominant players?
Well, if I had been smart, I would have had my book right over my shoulder so that you would see Canadian Spirits front cover, but it's somewhere up here. There it is, Canadian Spirits. Christine Sismondo and I wrote this in 2018. And when we started the project, it was about a year to a year and a half, the project. When we started it, there were about, I think, 50 or 60 distilleries in Canada. And by the time we finished, there was over 130. We literally had distilleries sending us spirits while we were like doing pages for the actual publication of the book. It was down to that. And since then, I don't know how many distilleries have opened in Canada since. And the holy grail of any distilling company outside of Quebec is whiskey. And I say outside of Quebec because Quebec is particularly fond of gin, and craft gin is a huge thing in Quebec. But what British Columbia did well, because British Columbia had 1/3 of all the craft distilleries in Canada when we wrote this book. And what they did was they passed legislation called BC Craft Distilling. And in order to qualify for BC Craft, you had to use 100% BC ingredients, save for any botanicals that just wouldn't grow in British Columbia, like oranges or what have you. So they got enormous tax breaks because of being BC Craft, got access to the liquor board that they could get product through there. They were allowed to run their own shops, which they're still not allowed to do in Quebec. As a distillery, you can run your own shop, but you don't make any more money than if you sell it through the SAQ, the government stores in Quebec. And that just spurred all this growth in British Columbia. And British Columbia, because Christine and I divided up the country, British Columbia was my territory. So I spent a lot of time driving around to distilleries in BC, and everybody was putting down whiskey. That was what everybody wanted to have that. Christine and I tasted well over 400 spirits for the book. And we walked away and we said, in 3 years' time, there's probably going to be a lot of really bad whiskey on the market. And it turned out we were completely wrong, because what happened was there was a lot of really good whiskey on the market. The ones who had really bad whiskey didn't last. Or they pivoted and they decided to do something quite different. But I've since tasted enormous amount of just solid Canadian whiskey. I'm drinking one right now from Vancouver Island, from the Stillhead Distillery, just north of Victoria, doing amazing stuff with cask finishes. He is, and there's so much excitement and so much enthusiasm for whiskey in Canada today. And whiskey sales are going up. I mean, everyone points to the Canadian boycott of American products as the reason that Canadian whiskey is on the rise. And certainly that's contributed to it. There's no question about it. But you've got all these little distilleries that nobody outside of their community has basically heard of. I mean, you're talking about 50 or 60 in Alberta. I probably know fewer than half of those, Caitlin.
Yeah.
They're going to their own communities. They could be doing amazing stuff. I'll make a post on Facebook or Blue Sky or something like that, and someone will come back and say, "Oh my God, have you heard of this distillery?" It's like, no, when the hell did they open? But they're already doing stuff in their community. And it's such an amazing time for Canadian spirits.
But was it always that easy? I would imagine that with those 8 major players in the early 2000s, when craft distilling was coming out, they would have had to find a way to distinguish themselves or to make their mark.
Yeah, and it was a tough time. I mean, it was really a tough time because unlike breweries, craft breweries came out with beers and said, "Hey, we're making beer with flavor," which the big guys aren't doing. The big guys are making really good whiskey. So as a craft distiller, you have to find a way to separate yourself from the herd. One of those ways has been single malt. And the only big distiller to date who has come out with a single malt is Crown Royal. The other way is provenance. Provenance is a big thing for craft distilleries. I talked to the owner of the Okanagan Spirits Distillery in the BC interior, and he says, he has people coming into their distillery saying, "Where's your grain grown?" And they don't mean is your grain grown in BC. They mean specifically what field is your grain grown. They want to know down to that level of specificity about where they're getting this stuff from. And I hear that again and again from distillers. They have consumers who just want to connect to the agriculture of the whiskey. And I think that's a superpower for craft distillers, frankly.
And Caitlin, why that time, do you think? Why do you think that was the moment that craft distillers started popping up?
I think having been in the industry for 10 years, like the specific craft industry, and seen like the growth of all the different companies, I think it was just the right time, right place. Craft brewing had kind of peaked and was starting to kind of teeter out. There's now a bit of a resurge with craft breweries, but there was a saturation of craft breweries. There was, especially for us in like the kind of prairie provinces, there was an abundance of grain. So much barley, so much wheat, so much rye, all available. But these breweries couldn't consume all of it. And then there was just enough people who had the idea, is like, why would we not be making single malt whiskey? Why would we not be making whiskey of some description? Where it got hard is opening a craft distillery with the focus on whiskey. You still need to age that liquid. So you saw a lot of, as Stephen was saying, like there's a lot of craft gins, a lot of craft vodkas, a lot of people doing like kind of weird and wonderful smaller projects to try and keep the lights on, keep everything going, and then dividing their focus between whiskey and white spirits. Not everyone did it that way, but a lot of the ones that are still alive right now kind of started out in white spirits to try and build up the brand presence, build up the notability, the kind of trust from the consumer so that they could then bring out their whiskey later in life. But yeah, I think it was just right place, right time. Like everyone had kind of already got to terms with the local grain, the local products with the craft brewing industry. And then obviously craft distilling kind of rode in right as that was kind of teetering out a bit.
Yeah, and a number of breweries also started distilling around that
Yes.
time. So
Yes, yeah.
that worked out nicely.
Yeah.
So we were talking about how exciting things are now. We sort of went back to the beginnings of the craft distilling movement. I'm going to bring us back to the current day and the current situation, which is these wonderful tariffs that I'm seeing rumors. I don't know what's going on with them now, but they have been in place and they have had an impact. So, Caitlin, can you tell me just from a production perspective?
Sure, yeah. Like for us, especially when they first started being mentioned, spoken about, the company I was at the time, we had just launched in the US. So there was big fear of tariffs, counter tariffs, also coming from Canada. and most of our raw materials in some fashion having to come from the US. We weren't sure what would be tariffed, what wouldn't. Would we be able to get our ex-bourbon barrels that we were aging our whiskey in? Would we be able to get like just basic pieces of equipment like barrel racks and parts for the distillery, replacement parts for stills and mash tuns and slide gates and all this kind of stuff. So that was the big fear going into it. A lot of it didn't come to anything, like a lot of the kind of raw material side of things. The good news was we always had our grain sourced in Canada and there's such an abundance of grain. So like your basic raw materials were still available to you. But from our perspective, kind of marketing the whiskey and marketing the spirits, it was a big shift in our focus. As opposed to trying to be this international brand, we were kind of going back to our roots. And as Stephen was saying, you're highlighting the local grain, the fact that you can physically come into the distillery and talk to the people that are making the product, the people that are blending the product, the people that are mashing every day, distilling every day. I think that's kind of what really surged up with all the tariffs. Like everyone really wanted to be able to touch the ground that the actual product was made on, be able to physically speak to the people who were making the product, which a lot of the kind of American brands were not doing. They're global brands and people couldn't really talk to like a distiller from Jack Daniels. Like they'd see people, if they went to Jack Daniels to do a tour, they wouldn't see anyone that was actually in the operations part of it. They'd see tour guides and an experience, and it was a great experience, but not the same as being able to kind of see the field that the grain is grown in, like right behind the distillery or down the street from the distillery.
And not to mention that with the, in reaction to the tariffs, there's also been in various parts of the country a ban on
Yes,
the import of those whiskeys
yes.
from the U.S. Stephen, what have you noticed in these times?
Well, in the early days following the ban of American spirits and wines and beers, not that the beers component was terribly notable. I had a lot of people saying, okay, what do I buy to replace my bourbon?
Yeah.
And so I mean, my initial reaction was, I like Lot 40 from Hiram Walker, JP Weiser. I think it makes a nice Manhattan. It is not a bourbon. It's 100% rye, but it's a Canadian 100% rye, so it has a different character to it. Alberta came out with this 9-year-old golden rye, which I think is absolutely gorgeous, makes a terrific Manhattan.
Yeah.
And then I started digging into it, and I found out that there are craft distilleries all across the country who are already making bourbon-style whiskeys. And I wrote a number of stories about it, and tasted a lot of these things. And some of them, I'll go back to the BRBN bourbon from Okanagan Spirits. They call it, this is our bourbon. Well, it's 55% corn and 45% malted barley. There's not a bourbon distiller in the United States who does that. Then they have their black bourbon, BLK BRBN, which they substitute the malted barley in that for chocolate malt, 100% chocolate malt, 45% of the whole thing, or 43%, sorry. And it's just a remarkable whiskey. But it's like a bourbon, but it's nothing like a bourbon at the same time. And I was tasting these spirits from all across the country, and everybody was, doing a pretty good job of it. And the Davin Kurgamaro, I always have a problem with Davin's name. He is the Kurgamaro. Thank you. He is the leading writer. He's the author of the Canadian Whiskey book, editions 1 and 2. And he actually came out on Instagram and said, look, why are we pretending that these aren't bourbons? Just call them bourbons. Who cares anymore? The rules are out the window. And you get names like can't call it bourbon with an asterisk with where the OU would be, or BRBN, or I think Sleeman called theirs traditional whiskey. And it's just all these little ways of hinting at being bourbon. And Davin was just saying, yeah, just call it bourbon. Who cares anymore? And I kind of agreed with him, frankly.
So a lot of people have just switched over at this point.
Yeah, the Tyler at Okanagan Spirits told me that out of the 50 or 60 products that they make, 80% of their sales are now whiskey. And I think he said that 75% of those were their bourbon style whiskeys. Like
Wow.
that's a huge change.
Yeah.
And it's really encouraged more people to discover the whiskeys that are being produced right here.
And the important thing is that people they develop new habits and they don't go back. You could put Jack and Jim and all the rest back on the shelves tomorrow, and it's going to take them several years to get back to sales pre-boycott, because people have gotten used to buying different things, and they're not going to change that overnight.
Interesting times. So here we are, we're at present day, we're talking about the tariffs. We'll see what happens with those tariffs and with the bans. And we have just 10 minutes left, but I wanted to just ask you both what you see in the future for Canadian whiskey.
Do you want to take this one first, Stephen?
I'll go ahead.
I think provinces will start trying to delineate like what their whiskey means. Like, and Alberta's already trying to put an Alberta Whiskey Act in place. I think there'll be more strict rules around different provinces and what they're making, whether it be grain type that you're using. I don't think they'll go as strict as Scottish rules and dictate still types and number of distillations. Even grain types, I think it'll be more based on origin to kind of differentiate each province's climate factors and kind of grain types that they're growing in each province. BC already have the craft rule, but I think there will be more of a, this is a BC whiskey, this is an Alberta whiskey, this is a Saskatchewan whiskey. That's kind of where I see the craft industry going anyway. Like a lot of people are trying to like have that pride over where it's made, where all your raw materials are from, and make things that are local to a province as opposed to seeing Canada as like the local factor.
That's interesting. It makes sense because if we think back to that table at the beginning, all the other categories had many subsections within them, and the Canadian was just blank. And I like that it's blank, and I hope that it still nationally remains, a blank slate, and there's that leeway. But to have certain categories, especially with Stephen talking about the incredible variety that's out there, to be able to put a name to some of those varieties to help the consumer get their bearings. It makes sense as a next step for an industry that's growing fast. Stephen, how about you? What are your comments on the future of Canadian whiskey?
Well, we have the Canadian Craft Distillers Alliance, and every province has their own distillers association as well. I don't think Nova Scotia, I don't think Newfoundland does, because they only have like 3. But the Canadian Craft Distillers Alliance are looking to trying to get some kind of uniformity across Canada. And there is this push by the federal government right now to dismantle provincial barriers. And everyone looks at the feds and say, well, why aren't you doing this? Provincial barriers are provincial. So it's the provinces that have to do this. The feds can encourage them, but it's the provinces that have to do it. And right now, the biggest problem, from what I understand, for the Canadian craft distillers is Quebec. Quebec is the most hidebound of the Canadian provinces in terms of dealing with their craft distillers. I think that if they can get some sort of uniformity, then we can start looking at marketing brand Canada. Because I would love to see subsections of Canadian whiskey. When we talked about this seminar, I mentioned to you several subsections that I would love to see go into play: 100% rye, 100% malt, both made with 100% Canadian grain. that type of thing I'd like to see specified as a type of Canadian whiskey. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity right now for Canada to make a big deal out of our whiskey. And that's going to translate not only into sales within Canada, sales internationally, it translates into tourism. As I said, I wrote basically a whiskey tour guide for Whiskey Advocate magazine for people to come to Vancouver Island. And, you do a bunch of distilleries in Victoria, just walking around, then rent a car and you go up to Campbell River. There's so much opportunity there that I think we're just leaving it on the table if we don't act now and allow this incredible market to really shine.
Anything to add, Caitlin?
Well said. Like,
Yeah,
honestly, I think being able to identify the different types of whiskey, associate them with a grain bill, and it's all like certified 100% Canadian, like can only do Canadian whiskey well in the future.
There's one more thing I would add, which is what we all hear about Generation Z and how Generation Z is not drinking, which has now been thoroughly debunked. Gen Z is coming back to alcohol in a big way, but they want a story.
Yeah.
They don't want to just sit around and drink beer or drink whiskey or drink vodka. They want some story behind it. And this is where I think Canadian spirits have this great opportunity, because we do use grain all grown in Canada. We do, have these wonderful stories of farm to bottle distilleries like Shelter Point up on Vancouver Island, who grow 90% of the barley they use in their single malt whiskeys. These are stories that are going to be eaten up by a new generation of drinkers. And what I've discovered in my research into Gen Z, because I kind of went down a Gen Z rabbit hole, is whiskey is their aspirational beverage. So because it is something that, you put it into a cut glass, it just looks classy somehow. And they see that as an aspirational drink, more so than beer, more so than gin, more so than even fancy cocktails. But they don't know anything about it. So there's an educational opportunity in there too. You just have to figure out how do you go about reaching that Gen Z segment of the marketplace, because they are now starting to earn more money and they're starting to go back out to bars, and the things are changing. And the more that we hold on to this whole idea that Gen Z isn't drinking and alcohol's in decline, the more we're missing the opportunity to capitalize on that as an industry.
Absolutely. And I think that can be said across the board, well beyond whiskey.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, did anyone have any questions for our wonderful panelists? I didn't see anything come through in the chat.
I saw a couple of things pop up.
Yeah, there were a few questions.
Okay.
So let me just scroll back, and I will just kind of clarify, like for our American friends joining us, if you did not know that what we're talking about here with like alcohol on the shelves in Canada, basically when the tariffs started, there was a boycott that happened with Canadians, but basically it was also our governments that said we are no longer going to be purchasing and selling these products. So we do not have access to them. So that's why things have changed a lot in the last year as far as sales go. I know because I work in the wine industry and we're doing pretty okay. So you kind of talked about this. If you want to just maybe really quickly, again, probably maybe more for Caitlin, but when you were talking about that 9.09% addition, how much of that addition do you think is noticeable?
I think it really depends on what you're using. If you're using like 9% of say like a sherry or a tequila, say, you're really going to taste it. And a whiskey, if you're using 9% of a slightly older whiskey, like it's going to give some characteristics of that, but it's not going to be noticeably different as a spirit. So it really just depends. That's kind of where the fun comes in when you're a blender, because you can kind of play around with different proportions of different things. You can also mix a bunch of those different things in that 9%. So you're kind of using it to make a blend, but you can put 1% of sherry, 2% of port. Like you can kind of play around with your different flavor profiles and create something really unique. So it really does just kind of depend. It just kind of leaves the door open to like really change it or just slightly change it and elevate it.
Okay. There was another question, and I'm curious about this myself, where if a lot of distilleries do use, like, let's say, neutral grain spirits, is there any way to know who's actually just sort of blending these spirits or who's actually like mashing and distilling? Like, is that something that's labeled somewhere, or do we just want to assume that everyone's kind of doing a bit of both?
From a labeling perspective, you don't really know. Like, it doesn't need to be disclosed. Whiskey's a protected category, same as gin, so they don't need to disclose it on the label, what their base ingredients are. You can tell most of the people using neutral spirits tend to not have an actual functioning distillery, or they're producing a lot more than the capacity of their distillery could physically put out.
Yeah, you just have to read labels carefully. A lot of like distilleries, a lot of distilleries that are actually making their own whiskeys will have distilled in on their label. Like they will specifically say that. And distilleries that are using sourced whiskey, which is not uncommon,
Yeah.
um, they will kind of say, oh, aged and bottled in rather than
Produced and
still
yeah.
produced. It's little things like that. But I just want to mention again, very important, never any GNS in Canadian whiskey ever, because that was mentioned, needs to be stricken from the dialogue. There's never any GNS. The other interesting thing, going back to Canadian and Alberta distillers and our ability to distill rye quite
Mhm.
effectively. Any Americans you might recall Whistle Pig, who are now distilling their own whiskeys. Whistle Pig got started by aging and bottling Canadian whiskey from Alberta.
Yeah.
And they're not alone in that. There was a lot of rye whiskey in particular in the United States that was being bottled that was Canadian, but the typeface on the Canadian whiskey was so small. You basically have to have a microscope to read it. So they would do as small as they could legally get away with to avoid mentioning that it was Canadian whiskey.
Hmm.
So then, like, I guess to follow up on that, could you not then use neutral grain spirits to age? Like, you couldn't put them in a barrel, I'm thinking the question is, and then age it and then call it whiskey.
Uh,
Legally, legally, yes, technically. You couldn't call it a single malt or anything like that, but technically, yes, you could.
if you age it for 3 years and wanted a bottle of really shitty whiskey, that would work.
Yeah, like it's not. I wouldn't be advised.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Someone is asking, I guess
Can I
any of you.
just
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to double check with our panelists because Canadian whiskey doesn't need to be distilled in Canada. So how would that work with the neutral grain spirit?
Well, you can. It's made. You can make neutral
Just
grain
make
here. Yeah.
just make the neutral grain spirit here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's producers of neutral grain. You can buy it
Oh
from
yeah.
them and technically, yeah, put it in barrels. I am again would not advise.
3/4 of the Quebecois gin market is based on purchased grain neutral
Yep.
spirit.
That's
For
interesting.
gin though.
Yeah, for
Yes.
gin.
Yeah.
Yes, for gin.
So question for any or all of you. What are your recommendations for your favorite BC rye whiskey.
There's a lot. I mean, because I just did a story on BC whiskeys, the first one that comes to mind is the one I'm drinking right now, which is Stillhead, north of Victoria, their Gary Oak. I didn't even know there was such a thing called Gary Oak, but apparently it's an oak species that's specific to the Pacific Northwest. And it's a Gary Oak finished rye whiskey, 100% rye. It's absolutely gorgeous. Same distillery does an Isla cask finished rye, which is almost as equally beautiful. But there's a lot of really good rye. Okanagan does some really nice rye whiskey as well. God, who else? Shelter Point did a rye, but it wasn't a blow me away rye. It was good, but it was yeah, there's like actually McAloney has even done a good rye. There's a lot going on in BC, and probably half of it I don't even know about.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there's stuff popping up constantly. I was like, the first thing that comes to mind for me is Sons of Vancouver. They
Oh, of
do a
course.
series called Realms of Rye. They do rye really well.
How could I forget Sons? I just mentioned them in Forbes magazine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sons is doing some really good stuff. They're winning a lot of awards for their rye as well, and against some really big players.
I'm still exploring the category, but one that's got my attention right now. I think it's made in Alberta. It's called Greenhenge
Yes,
Ale
yeah, that is, yeah.
Whiskey.
Yeah, I've got a bottle of it somewhere behind me.
It just has a really interesting fermentation character, and I'm pretty sure it's rye as well.
Yes, yeah.
And just the interplay of the rye, sort of the sharpness of the rye and the roundness of the esters is I find quite compelling. But there's so many delicious ones.
Yeah, and again, for any Americans, the Canadian take on rye is a very, very broad spectrum, whereas the American straight rye tends to be a very specific flavor profile. You're looking for that
Mhm.
spicy punch of rye. In Canada, you can get everything from something that's really soft, really smooth, to something that's really in your face. It's a very, very broad spectrum of rye.
Mirella, I have a question, which is you've been doing so much in beer now for, a while. What made you interested in applying for a whiskey related scholarship?
Oh, well, I've actually been studying spirits for a while as well. I have obviously my WSET spirits courses. I also took a course on bartending in the US called Bar 5, which was grueling. And that was more, I guess, on the history and service side. And so I wanted to round that off with some more technical knowledge. And that's, yeah, this I just wanted to do something fun for my pay it forward, and Canadian Whiskey is having a moment. And I approached Stephen, and he graciously agreed to share his experience with us. And then we reached out to Caitlin for the more production side. Um, the things that I learned in the course were super interesting to me in terms of rounding off my knowledge, but I didn't want to start talking about like how to clean distilling equipment and things, I felt this would be a more compelling topic. But yeah, I'm studying I'm studying with spirits, and I've started studying sake as well. I'm still a beer gal though. Still a beer gal. But I think in the realm of sensory, the more you can taste different things and experience different dimensions of flavor, the better a taster you become. And that's,
Yeah.
I guess, really what started me on my path towards spirits and other beverages.
Mirella and I planned part of this on the boarding to a flight from Belgium.
That sounds really awful. Um, Another maybe quick question. do any of you have any insights into the role of women in Canadian whiskey, like either now or historically?
I think that's not a short question to answer,
Right.
at least for me. I could do a whole other seminar on women and whiskey in Canada and worldwide. Just I could talk for hours and hours on it.
Okay.
I think, as everyone here probably knows, like you're in some sort of fermented beverage industry. Most people in pink boots anyway. So it is still male dominated. Every single person that works for me at ADL is male. Same thing when I was at Eau Claire, pretty much everyone that reported to me was male. What I have found is Canada as a country and as an industry, a Canadian whiskey industry, they're way more receptive to different ways of doing things just in general. So being a female in the industry is not that out of the norm. I know a vast array of females across the country in different distilling roles. We actually have a group chat and we all chat daily about things going on in the whiskey industry throughout Canada. And that's from sales reps to distillery managers to owners of distilleries to just people kind of like wanting to get into the industry, bartenders, people that run whiskey shops, do whiskey tastings, all that kind of stuff. I think it's an exciting place to be as a female. It is not for the faint of heart, as all of you probably already know. There is still a lot of kind of pushback on, especially on the front facing things. If you're at whiskey shows, people are asking like if you actually know what you're talking about. They are questioning it if you're saying you're a distiller or a blender or anything. They don't quite believe it. But it is getting better. I think historically in every country, females were the bakers, the brewers, and then the distillers. So it's a natural thing to kind of come back around to. Even in Scottish history, the females were the ones that did all the brewing and distilling, and then it was taken over by men. And then it's just became a male-dominated industry since then. But as I said, I'll stop myself because I could go on for hours and hours and hours and hours and tell you about every year of my 10 years in the industry and how it's evolved over those 10 years. But it's a fun industry and I would recommend it for any female looking to get into distilling. I think it is rewarding. There will be ups and downs, but there is with every career, I think.
Yeah.
The only thing that I would add is a shout out to Caitlin's former employer, Eau Claire Distillery in Alberta. And not only were they constantly sending me press releases about how proud they were of the fact, I think they were about 50% as a company, almost 50% female. But once a year, they released a whiskey on National Women's Day that was the creation of all their female employees,
Yeah.
which I thought was very cool.
I think you can't see all of us, but I think all of us ladies are nodding our heads because we
Everyone's
know
like,
exactly what you're talking about, Caitlin. And I think we definitely would love to plan something like, in the future with more in depth, because I know a lot of us are, in the industry, we see this every day, but also just interested in the history part of it, and how things are changing. So I don't think we have any more questions. So before I stop everything, I'll just say thank you. And I will